Alright, so we're going to kind of review some of the stuff we've gone over in class and just kind of talk through it so that you've got a reference you can go back and watch and review as much as you need to. Alright, so we talked about a variable. We set that as with the var keyword, and we say var, and then we can name our variable anything we want to. So we might say some var, and then we can assign some information to it. And that's really all we're doing with variables, is getting a handle or a name that we can assign information to. Okay, so in this case we've said some var equals test, and so if we use some var anywhere in our programming, we're essentially using the word test. Okay, so if we want to, let's say we wanted to create a little pop-up that has our variable information in it, so we can use the word alert, and this is a built-in thing in JavaScript, and we can say alert some var. Okay, so if we run our test, it's going to pop up and say test right there, because that's what we actually passed in, was that information. Okay, we also talked about that if you didn't want to pop something up, but you're trying to bug test and see if something's messed up or trying to figure out what's going on, you can also use the console.log, and so we could pass our variable to it, and if we have the console open and we run it, then it's going to output that there as well. So we can use that to test and see if our code is doing something we don't expect. We can use console.log to kind of figure out what's going on at any point in that thing in our program. Okay, so we talked about being able to access different information within our HTML, and we did that by saying assigning to a variable. So we might say give it a variable of heading, and we could say that that is equal to, I'm going to close that out and comment that out while I'm thinking about it. We have a heading that is equal to document.get element by ID. Okay, and we would pass in an ID that we want to get, and so we've assigned this information to this variable. Now, what information have we grabbed? At this point, absolutely nothing, but if we had an ID attribute in here called heading, then we would now access test as, or this entire element is what we've actually selected. So that entire element and all of its information associated with it is assigned to the variable called heading. Okay, and then we kind of sidetracked a little bit and talked about objects in general. Okay, so we said, when we access heading, if we were to, just as an example, if we were to pass in the heading variable to console.log, if we looked at console and ran it, it's going to give us the entire object. As you can see, it's actually calling it an object, but it's not just giving us like we would want. It's not just giving us the contents of that. And the reason that's true is because it's an object. So let's back up a little bit and talk about objects. Objects are things. Okay, in programming, it's sort of a reference point, or it's some sort of thing. And by that I mean, if we use a real world example, we talked in class about an example of a car. Okay, a car is an object in the real world, and it has different things associated with it. So in programming, we'd call those things properties. Okay, so we have a car that has properties like color. Okay, it might have a color of red, it might have a brand of Lamborghini, it might have a speed of 10 miles an hour, it might have a direction of north because it's heading north. It might have lots of different properties. It's got a height, the width, the weight. All these things are called properties of that car. They're things that we associate that information as being specific to that object and that object alone. And that's true in programming. If we have an object, then we have properties associated with that object. Okay, and so hold on to that. And then also think with an object we have what are called methods. So with the method, in our real world example, we might say that a car not only has different properties, but it also can do things. Okay, it can take certain actions. So we might say, if we were trying to merge this example, we might say that a car has a method of accelerating, and it's got a method of deaccelerating, it's got a method of turning, it's got a method of backing up, a method of braking. It's got all these actions that it can do. So in programming, every object also has methods that we can use to take actions on the properties or actions on the method itself. And the reason we talk about objects so early on is because everything in JavaScript is an object. Okay, everything has properties and everything has methods associated with it. And that's also true with our HTML. We've talked about HTML being a DOM, a document object model, and all that's saying is that when the HTML is sent to the browser doesn't just take a bunch of text and show it on a page. It actually takes that and parses it and breaks it down into a group of objects. Okay, we call those nodes. And so this might be a node, and this might be a node. And even though right here we're just seeing, strings of text, it's actually, the browser itself has converted into objects that have properties and methods. So what kind of properties might a node have? Those would be things like CSS properties, right? We assign a width or a height or a margin or a background color or a color. We apply states on whether it's hovered or not. These are all properties of information related to that node or to that object. Okay, and there's a lot of other properties just besides CSS properties that we might use. So like I said, everything in JavaScript is an object. And so we could say, okay, this variable up here is using a string, which is just a series of characters. Okay, we always put quotes around it, around a string, just to simplify that, or to symbolize that these are just a string of characters that we're going to work with. But in JavaScript, it sees it as being an object, and so it allows us to, I'm going to comment this out, to look at this as an object that has certain properties. So what's a property that a string might have? Well, in this case, we might say that we want the length of it, how many characters are in that string. So if we run it, we're going to see it actually gives us 4 because there's 4 characters in that string. So that's the length is something that tells us about the object, right? And there's a lot of other properties and stuff that we could get to. Now, I'm not so worried that you know what all these properties are, that you know what all the methods are available for all the different types of objects within JavaScript. Just understand that everything is an object and every object has properties and methods associated with it. It's also possible, and we'll get into this further on, that you can create your own objects with their own properties and methods. But by default, everything in JavaScript has everything predefined, every predefined object in JavaScript has predefined properties and methods that we can use. Okay? So getting back to our example here, we've assigned this. We've said, okay, heading is referring to an object called getElementById. So at this point, we are saying heading is equal to this object, and that means we can access all of its properties and methods, right? So let's say that we wanted to get just the word test, just the contents of this object. Well, we could do that by saying enter HTML, spelled right, HTML. And of course, enter HTML is nothing more than a property. And so if we came in here and we uncommented that and ran it, then we're going to see, I forgot to comment this out as well. We're going to see that it outputs test just like we would want it to. Okay. If we could also do another property called node name, and that's going to give us the name of that node, which in this case is H2. So if we run it, There we go. We see that it's returning that. As I said before, there's tons of properties and methods associated with all these. It's not that important that you know what they are, just understand that there are a bunch of them. And we'll go over some of the more common ones, and the rest of them, I'll give you some references that you can look at to look up what other stuff, information is associated with each one of these types of objects. All right. So at this point, we're accessing information inside our HTML. Now let's go back to inner HTML. Okay. So we've retrieved that information, but we can also come in, since we assign it to heading, we're saying that heading is the same thing as this. It's the same thing as that value. It's sort of a reference to it, if you will. So we could come in and say heading equals new info. Alright, so let's see what that does. Does absolutely nothing. Okay, so I mistyped something in here. So this is in order to retrieve it. Let's try it this way. So let's say instead of retrieving it, we try to set the value on it, and we could say new value. So now you see that it's actually, even though our HTML hasn't changed, after the page loads, our JavaScript runs, and we are saying, okay, let's set that to a new value. And it happens right there on the page, just like we want it to. All right. Another way we can do it, you can see we've got two H2s over here, two H2 nodes. Let's say we want to access both of them. We could do that by, let's comment these out. And let's keep moving down here. Let's create a new var heading. And we're going to use a method called get elements by tag name. Okay, and then instead of passing an ID like we did on the last one, we pass in the name of the tag or the node that we want to access. So now we've got an object. Heading has been assigned an object that contains both of the H2 because it's actually matched twice. Alright, so we can't just come in and, if we said console.log heading let's say we want to access the inner HTML of this one, this is not going to work. Alright, it's going to give us an undefined, because now we're not talking about one node, we're talking about two. So how can we go about accessing each individual one? Okay, so when we grab all the elements by tag name, which is what we're doing right here, it's actually returning a list, or an array is the more accurate term, of all of those elements that match H2. Okay, so we can specify it by number. We can say, okay, I want the first one in that list, I want the second one in that list, and on and on. In this case, we've got 1 and 2. But remember that in programming, we always start counting from the 0, not from 1. So if I want to access the first one, I would actually say 0 as being the one I want to get, not 1. Okay, so if I did that and then run it, it's going to give us tests just like we'd want it to. This is called the index of a value in a list, or index of an array item. So if I change that index to 1, hopefully we're going to get value, right? So let's run it. And you can see just like we wanted to, it shows up as value. Okay, so that's how we might do it if we get an array of items that we need to match through. It's just as simple as using the index of it and then accessing the properties of it once we've specified it. Okay, so let's comment that out and keep moving on. Let's look at functions next. So we can create a function, and we said in class that a function is basically a block of code that we can reuse over and over. Alright, so we might say a function of, let's be creative here and say some function. Alright, so what we've done is we've created this function that says whenever we call this, execute the code that's inside of it. Okay, so we might say alert heading. Okay, and we actually need, since we're still using that array, we might say let's get the text for that first one. Okay, so if we run it, nothing happens, because when we have a function, it's not actually executing that code until we ask it to. So we could execute it multiple times or once or anything we want to. So to actually execute it or to call that function, we say some function like that. Okay, so then when we refresh it, it's going to give us a little alert that has that value passed into it, just like we want it to. And if we want to, the other thing we can do with a function is to actually pass an argument or a parameter inside of it, and we can use that throughout the code inside that function. So you could kind of think of this as, when we're creating the function, we're going to create some placeholders that we're going to use throughout the function, so it allows our function to be reusable on, say, different items. Like right here, we've got a function that says, alert the heading 0, the inner HTML of that. But what if we wanted a function that could do it on any item that we specified? So what we could do is come in and we pass our parameters in here. So I can say, okay, the first parameter that is sent into the function is going to have, we're going to use a variable called name for it. Okay, then I can use that throughout the function as if it was whatever we passed into it. So when we call it, we could say heading 0, and at this point our function is going to do the exact same thing it was doing before. Alright, so I run with JS, it still pops up and says test. That's what we're wanting it to do. But now if we wanted to use the function again, and I could say, okay, I actually want the text from the other one as well. So this is going to run twice. We're going to get 2 pop-ups. Right? First one says test, then the second one says value. So we've used the same function to do different things just by passing in a parameter or an argument to that function that we can do stuff with. Okay? So this allows us, this is a fairly simple example, doesn't really do a whole lot, but you can put a lot of code inside a function to to do a specific thing and not have to write that code over and over and over every time you need it. Okay, so let's keep on moving. We also talked in class about if-else statements. So the syntax for those is going to follow this. So an if-else statement is kind of the foundational building block for anything in programming. It basically says, okay, anytime we want to program, like we said in class, we're trying to solve problems. Okay, we have some information, we want to do something with it and solve a problem. Those are the 3 key things we want to do anytime we approach programming. So the if-else statement allows us to evaluate whether something is true, whether it equals something else, and basically test for something. And if it equals what we think it is, then it'll execute the code inside here, on this line. And if not, then it's going to execute on this line. So let's say in our function we wanted to, or if in our if-else statement, in fact, let me just go ahead and copy and paste those. We're going to say pass in some function. Okay, so we're going to say if something's true, then return the value of the first H2, and if it's not, then return the value of the second one. So how do we actually run our test? Okay, we've got this little area here, and that's where we put our comparison that we're going to evaluate to see if it's true or not. So let's actually create another variable that has some information assigned to it. So let's say var number equals 5. Okay. So let's just do it this way for now. Screw it. Yeah, just do a 5. So we can come in and say if number is greater than 4, okay, so we just read it straight across. Say if number is greater than 4, then it's going to execute this function. Else, otherwise, it's going to run this one. So in this case, we would expect it to run the first one because the value of number actually is greater than 4. So we run this, expect an alert that says test because test is the value of the first one. Okay. And I didn't actually comment these out, so that actually created a few too many. Alright, so we can also do other things. We can say if it equals 4. Now we said we've used the equal sign elsewhere to assign values to a variable or to assign values to our object or property, stuff like that. So we can't just use a single equal sign. So we use two equal signs to compare. So we say number equals 4. If the number equals 4, then alert the first one, otherwise alert the second one. Right, so if we run it, it's going to say value, which is what's alerted from the second one down here, because in fact number doesn't equal 4. Okay, so that's another comparison. We've looked at greater than. Of course, you can do less than. That's going to do exactly what you expect. And then we could say if it does not equal 4, and we use that with the exclamation point and an equal sign, and that says if number does not equal 4, then it's going to execute. And of course that means that it's going to execute the first one because the value of number is in fact not 4. Alright. We can also chain together several if statements, and by using the else if. Okay, so we can say something else, right? So we don't even actually have to use a function. We could just say alert no match or something like that. We can do anything inside of these if-then statements, or inside of our functions for that matter as well. So we can put a comparison in here as well, where we could say, okay, if number equals 3. We'll say, let's change this to say if the number is less than 4, then it's going to run this. Otherwise, if it's not, that means it's greater than 4, then it's going to keep going. It's going to keep going through this list of comparisons. In our case, the number is 5, so it's not going to match this one either. And so it's going to actually execute the last line of code, which is alert no match. So let's run that and see if it does what we expect. Alright, pops up there, no match, just like we thought. And so we can use that to chain together multiple conditions that we're trying to look for. Okay, so if we're trying to solve a problem, we might say, okay, if it's, this particular value is greater than something, then we want to do one thing. If it's less than it, we want to do something else. And that's really the core of programming. Okay, the if-else statement is considered an algorithm because it's a logical statement that says if this isn't true, then do this, otherwise do this. Very simple, but definitely the basic building block of everything that we do. Alright. So then the other thing that we looked at is that, okay, at the very beginning, we assigned some information. We said it's a string. And that's a type of variable that we can use in JavaScript. And of course, over here we assigned this, and that's a document object that we were referencing. So that's just considered a straight element object. But then there's also other variables types that we can have. Okay, so I might say var HTML equals 5, okay, which we've actually done this up here. That's a type of number. Okay, so we have strings, we have objects, and we have numbers. And we also have what's called a Boolean. I'm going to spell that out so you can see it. And that is either going to be true or false. Okay, so if we're testing whether something's true or false, or we're trying to use it basically as a switch throughout our code, we can say, okay, a Boolean is something that either equals true or false. It's not a string of 4 characters, TRUE, or anything like that. It's actually a value of either true or false, and that's the only thing that it can be. So those are the main types. There's a couple other types of objects in JavaScript that we can assign to variables. We'll look at those more in depth. We did mention briefly arrays. That's going to be another type of object that we have access to, and we'll talk about that more in future classes. But that's, for now, this is all we're going to cover.